My name is Jake Zaratsian, and today I'm here with Connor Foley, General Manager and co-founder of Downstream by Jungle Scout. Connor, thanks for being here.
Yeah, great to be here. Excited.
Awesome. So today, Connor's going to be sharing his top advertising strategies for Amazon in 2022, as well as sharing his most boldest predictions for the platform this year. Connor's the perfect guest to bring on today. He's worked within the walls of Amazon and has over 2 decades of advertising experience. So Connor, again, thanks for being here.
All right, let's do it.
All right, let's jump right into it. Over 50% of brands still struggle managing their advertising spend. Connor, my first question for you is, what are the biggest pain points that brands struggle with the most on Amazon, and how can they overcome them?
Yeah, so glad you asked. So when it comes to advertising on Amazon, there's really 3 primary pain points that brands are looking to solve for. So one is just scale. I mean, most of these brands have massive catalogs on Amazon. You take Procter & Gamble, for example. Okay. They have over 10,000 ASINs on Amazon alone. So it's a lot to get your arms around. 2, advertising on any e-commerce, and Amazon specifically, is a highly dynamic exercise. You know, you've got constantly changing pricing, inventory, ratings, reviews, third-party sellers competing with first-party vendors. And all of these variables need to be factored in, accounted for, mitigated, because they're absolutely going to impact your performance in one way or another. And then 3, you've got this rapidly expanding ecosystem. So as though it wasn't challenging enough to get your arms around advertising on Walmart, now you've got, or advertising on Amazon, now you've got Walmart, Target, Kroger, et cetera. And so all of this becomes exponentially more challenging as new advertising platforms launch. And so, as a former Amazon employee, my co-founder and I saw this opportunity up close, saw the challenges that brands were experiencing here, and recognized that it really demanded a native solution built from the ground up to be able to meet the unique needs of advertising on an e-commerce platform. And so that's really what Downstream is, allowing these brands to better measure, manage, and optimize their growth investments on Amazon and other e-commerce platforms.
Okay, Connor, so one thing I've noticed a lot this year, and I'm sure a lot of you have as well, is Amazon's really testing out new ad placements. They're adding more inventory for advertisers to bid on, which of course probably comes from increased competition on the marketplace. With increased competition, as more advertisers expand their budgets, how can brands be more precise with their ad spend and be smarter?
Yeah. Glad you asked. Highly relevant question right now. So you are correct. We've seen a lot more competition and being a second price auction, that results in larger investments from most advertisers. I mean, what we saw during the pandemic was just this consumer mix shift of so much of the brick and mortar traffic now moving online. And so brands recognized that the value of their trade and shopper investments at the point of sale in a brick and mortar store was suddenly a lot less valuable. And so many of those dollars began moving online, following those consumers. And so with that shift in consumer behavior, brands began shifting their budgets. And as a second price auction, like I said earlier, you begin to see increased CPCs, more competition, et cetera. And that just makes it all the more challenging to be able to hit very specific KPIs. In this case, RoAS. And so, really the best way to go about being able to hit very precise RoAS objectives is through technology. The reality is that your consumers are in there and they're shopping day and night, weekends, et cetera. And so having the ability to optimize and manage all of your bidding strategies, et cetera, through machine learning algorithms that are running 24/7, 365 is really the only way that you're going to be able to hit that very precisely.
Makes a lot of sense. Cool. All right. So I feel like a lot of brands, consider their RoAS as the North Star of KPIs, the number one KPI that they want to increase year over year. With that, and if that is true, what are the main factors that affect RoAS for these brands?
Yeah, so RoAS is really an imperfect metric, but it's highly variable from category to category. If you look at RoAS, or return on ad spend, it's really a matter of sales divided by ad spend, and so getting into the core inputs there, the biggest factors are going to be ASP, or average selling price, for that category, and then the competitive landscape. you simply look at like a $4 disposable razor versus a $600 robot vacuum. You're just not going to see the same RoAS profile. So, oftentimes you hear people asking like, oh, what's the ideal RoAS? It's a silly question because it varies so much from category to category depending on the average selling price. And then, of course, like I said, the competitive landscape can be so different. Speaking to that disposable razor, when you get into these CPG categories, you're competing against the Procters and Gambles, the Unilevers of the world, who are really bringing those notorious kind of Death Star CPG advertising budgets. And that's putting a ton of upward pressure on bids and CPCs.
Makes a lot of sense. With that, is RoAS considered the main goal? I know a lot of brands, when they either take on a new agency to do a lot of their advertising work, they're sort of asking for two different things. We want to increase our market share on Amazon as well as our ROI. Is that an achievable goal, or should brands clearly be defining a true number one and then a number two as well?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that one. I mean, it really, again, depends on, most specifically, the competitive landscape. I mean, in an ideal situation, you've got no competition. You can both grow market share and hit your ROAS goals at the same time. But that's just not the reality that most of us are operating in. And, like I said earlier, ROAS is really an imperfect metric because it's so variable from category to category, tactic to tactic. So, what the smartest marketers are doing on Amazon is that they define what it is that's their high-level business goal, and then defining objectives from business line to business line. And that's going to dictate what your KPIs are. And so it may not be that ROAS is the KPI that you're trying to drive towards. Perhaps it is about driving market share, which may result in a negative ROAS because, again, competition is going to influence that. And then, once you've been able to define your objectives and your KPIs, business line to business line, it's about segmenting further and then segmenting down to tactics. Because, it makes sense that you're not going to get the same ROAS for your branded terms as you are for your competitors' branded terms that you may be conquesting with advertising. And so comparing the two on a ROAS basis is really apples to oranges, and you don't want to be making those comparisons because one may be much more incremental to your business.
Let's move on to a very, very, very hot topic now. 2022 is supply chain challenges. So in our advertising report, we found that over 90% of brands are still losing revenue due to these supply chain issues that they've experienced in the last 2 years. How can brands best mitigate or navigate around their specific supply chain issues?
Yeah, that is a challenging one, but a highly relevant question. Unfortunately, we don't own ships, so can't necessarily help you out there. But it's really about having the preparation up front, right? So first off, perhaps you have hero ASINs where you're trying to drive all of your advertising traffic towards. So first, let's identify, assuming that product goes out of stock or is a weak inventory position, where are we going to pivot to next and where are we going to pivot to after that? So have your secondary, tertiary, et cetera, ASINs for your different tactics. We want to go here, then here, then here. And then what is it that is your trigger moment for you to make that decision? So what you want to look at is, here's my inventory position. Here is my average demand during this period. I have this many weeks of cover. And then you align with your team to say, okay, once we hit 6 weeks of cover, we're going to pivot to the next ASIN because we're at risk of running out of stock. And then third is making sure that your entire team has that at their fingertips, right? So you have to have all of those tools in place and have the visibility and communication within your team so that they can call that audible at the line of scrimmage. Downstream, we provide our rulebooks automation where you can set these thresholds and sensitivities so that our system can make those decisions programmatically on your behalf, making it much easier.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Well, I know we've talked a lot about how automation can help brands improve their ROI, but one thing we haven't touched on so far is how a tool like Downstream can help brands increase their operational efficiency on Amazon, gain a lot more time back to work inside their clients' accounts rather than on them. So can you speak to a little bit of the importance of how Downstream or automation in general can help brands increase that operational efficiency?
Yeah. Absolutely. Happy to speak to that. So, when we're talking about these massive catalogs, huge scale, all of the unique dynamics of advertising on an e-commerce platform, and then, oh, by the way, it's growing much larger than just Amazon. We've got retail media advertising on Walmart, Target, Kroger, et cetera. it really is quite an operational burden to manage all of that.
Okay.
And so, at Downstream, we provide a suite of automations that kind of follow along a spectrum of more hands off the wheel to more hands on the wheel, depending on kind of where our customers are at and how comfortable they are with being able to kind of remove themselves more from the process. And then Downstream is making millions of optimizations every day on behalf of our customers. And so, trying to replicate what we're doing with our machine learning algorithms with human beings is just unreasonable, right? Because our systems are running 24/7, 365. They're not taking lunch breaks. They're not taking weekends off or holidays. So it's just an incredible scale that our customers have at their disposal, and an incredible competitive advantage as well. And so with that, they're able to gain operational efficiency to do higher leverage things for their business while our systems take over and eliminate much of that manual work. So at the end of the day, you're just never going to be able to compete against machine learning algorithms with fingers on keyboards. And then also you gain much greater operational efficiency, allowing you to kind of reallocate those resources to other parts of the business and do other things and maybe think more strategically about the business.
Awesome. Well, great. Now, we do want to ask if you guys have any questions to put them in the chat here, put them in the comments, and we'll have Connor answer them. But in the meantime, so we can collect some questions, Connor, if you don't mind, give us your top Amazon advertising predictions, whether it's this year or in the future. What do you think is going to happen in the next 2-5 years advertising on Amazon?
Oh, boy. Exciting question. All right. So, as a former Amazonian, I understand the culture well. So, at a high level, one thing that you can count on with Amazon is that they are constantly going to be innovating, testing, iterating. And I think you find that oftentimes the press and those of us who are serving Amazon brands and sellers, you get kind of wound up when you see something new that Amazon's doing.
Okay.
But the reality is that Amazon is testing, iterating all day long. And so it may very well be something that within the walls, they're like, we'll see if this works, and then we'll spike it if it doesn't. So I would anticipate that we're going to continue to see more of that because it's just part of the culture of Amazon. So more tests with automation, more iteration, and then more things, frankly, being spiked because maybe they failed, because that's how you develop a culture of success the way that Amazon has. So that's kind of at a high level what you can anticipate. But, a few areas that I'm watching very specifically that I'm excited about, particularly OTT, over-the-top television. That's such an exciting space for advertising. I mean, you look at what Amazon's developed with their Fire TV devices, their streaming capabilities. They're in such an amazing position to be able to completely disrupt television advertising. And I, for one, I'm looking forward to the day when I'm not watching television, getting irrelevant, catheter ads disrupting me during my viewing time. And instead, I'm getting kind of helpful reminders that, hey, Connor, why don't you purchase that dog food you forgot to buy earlier? And I can do it right there in context, the exact brand, have it shipped to my house, Prime, 2-day, perfect. So I think OTT is a really exciting space to watch. I'm also very curious to see whether or not Amazon does something to kind of counter what Walmart has done by bringing their brick and mortar footprint to bear in being able to do some attribution for customers who have viewed ads and then purchased in store, et cetera. Obviously, Amazon doesn't have that same brick and mortar footprint. So how do they innovate perhaps to try to do something that is complementary to the business, but also presents that same kind of value to their advertisers?
Awesome. Those are real interesting predictions. So thank you for sharing those, Connor. Now we're going to get into a few questions. And thank you guys so much for submitting a few questions here. And let's go ahead, Connor, give me a second to pull one up here. Let's go ahead and, okay, so first question for you, Connor, is how does Amazon's ad business compare to that of Google or Facebook? And then what do you believe is the trajectory for its growth?
Oh boy, I could wax on this one all day. I like this question. So, I think something that's often misunderstood about Amazon's advertising business and why it's seen such explosive growth is the fact that having attributed sales is really the holy grail of product advertising. And it's such a game changer for most marketers.
Yeah.
So, historically what you've seen is that the marketer's dollar is going to move to the most demonstrable ROI.
Okay.
You've probably heard the old saw that I know that half my ad budget is wasted. I just don't know which half. Well, Amazon in many ways has solved for that in that you've got 2-week last click sales attribution. It's kind of a beautiful mousetrap. And so the marketer's dollar is always going to move to that more demonstrable ROI. And that's just a higher bar than paying for clicks or impressions. I'm actually paying for sales. And so that's one way in which Amazon's advertising business is very different from Google and Facebook. Additionally, Amazon has the ability to kind of pull from a whole additional bucket of funds. Google and Facebook, traditionally, they're pulling their dollars from brand marketer dollars. So think, Super Bowl ads, television ads, print, et cetera. All that traditional advertising comes from brand dollars. But then you've got trade or shopper, which is everything that's point of sale or in store. And that's traditionally spent on retail promotions via like co-op funds, et cetera. Amazon actually is able to pull from both of these buckets of funds. So arguably, they have a TAM, that total addressable market, that may be as big as twice as big as Google or Facebook's. So in terms of the opportunity, it's quite large, and I would argue it's probably larger than Google or Facebook's at scale. And then lastly, one of the really interesting paradigm shifts that advertising has brought about to Amazon's retail business is that, in the past, e-commerce was really about being profitable on a transaction by transaction basis.
Okay.
How much am I making for selling this widget to Jake? But now with the advertising business, it's becoming more about monetizing the traffic, which is really interesting. Getting the consumers there so I can sell their clicks and eyeballs. Right. Which is actually much more similar to Google and Facebook. So in some sense, Amazon's retail business is becoming a little bit more like Google or Facebook's, which is a total paradigm shift, and it'll be interesting to see how that disrupts things from an e-commerce perspective for the entire industry.
That's interesting. Yeah, Amazon's sort of able to put their hand in both buckets, whereas the other platforms are sort of stuck in one, or at least for the time. Interesting. Sorry. Cool. Well, let me get to another question here, Connor. We have a question here. What kinds of ads on Amazon do consumers find the most appealing, and why do they prefer one ad type over the other on Amazon?
Yeah. This one's actually pretty straightforward when you think about it. It's really about the placements that are most organic to the platform. So that's why sponsored products perform so well. It appears very native to Amazon search. It's Makes right sense. There in feed. There's barely any call out for the fact that it's an advertisement. And so with that, you're going to get the highest engagement from consumers, clicks, conversions, etc. The less organic the ad product appears to the platform, generally the less it's going to perform.
That makes a lot of sense. Is that perhaps why maybe the sponsor display in that regard then not perform as well as it currently is, because it's more of a display ad? Or it's interesting that the ads that perform the best or most appealing are the ones that are disguised essentially as ads.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit it there in that it's a display ad. And that's an interesting thing about that sponsored display unit. It's kind of an odd duck in that it is this display ad unit being sold alongside these search ads. Right. And that's why generally, in my opinion, the performance looks so much worse than sponsored brands or sponsored products. Typically, in purchasing display ads, you're doing it on an impression basis because you're trying to assign some value to the impressions, the fact that people are seeing this big display advertising and getting some sort of brand halo, whereas search advertising is much more performance focused. So it is kind of awkward in that you've got this display unit that's sold alongside these search ads. That's
a really interesting kind of dive there. So another question I want to get to that I thought was really cool is, you touched on this earlier when talking about category differences and variables for specifically RoAS KPIs. Is The question here is, what are some product categories that have higher RoAS than others? And why does RoAS vary depending on the category?
Yeah. So I'll circle back to some of what I said previously. It's varying largely on average selling price or ASP. So, the CPG categories where they're smaller dollar value per transaction are going to generally be lower RoAS versus categories like consumer electronics or home, et cetera, where you've got higher ASPs. And then also the competitive factors, and it actually correlates to the ASPs in that you've got these massive CPG companies, like I said earlier, the P&Gs, the Unilevers of the world, who are the largest advertisers on planet Earth and thus the most competitive. And so not only do you have lower ASPs, you also have the largest ad budgets and the most competition. So it's typically those kind of health and personal care, those CPG categories where you're going to see the thinnest RoAS from in advertising perspective. And then in those categories that have higher ASPs and then are also less penetrated by these large advertisers where you're going to see a higher RoAS. One of the highest RoAS categories I've seen year after year is musical instruments in Amazon's consumer electronics category.
Why do you think that is? Is less CPG companies competing there?
It's very high ASP products generally, and it's not generally dominated by like a few large brands. Sure, you've got like Fender and Gibson, but you don't have somebody like, say, Procter & Gamble, or even in consumer electronics, somebody like a Samsung coming in with massive budgets, right?
That's interesting. Okay. Cool. So another great question here. So this question here is, beyond traditional ads, so your sponsored brand, sponsored display, Amazon ads, what other suggestions do you have to create more awareness and drive more sales on the platform? So an example here would be, that Greg mentions, is Amazon Live. What other sort of sources there to create more awareness would you suggest?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are some really cool tactics out there that can allow you to drive greater awareness for your products. If you are in a category that's eligible for vendor-powered coupons, for example, having an always-on small discount vendor-powered coupon gets you into a whole host of Amazon merchandising that can really increase your exposure. I haven't seen the traffic data since I left Amazon, but back in the old days, the gold box and the deals pages, these were some of the highest trafficked pages on all of Amazon. And so being able to get your products surfaced there where a high volume of Amazon traffic is going through a really small vendor power coupon, for example, gets you much greater reach than you would otherwise have just with your products on your detail page.
Interesting. Okay. And this is actually a similar question. So any recommendations for external advertising or marketing to drive more traffic to the platform? So again, sort of outside of the Amazon ads, what would you recommend doing off Amazon?
Yeah, that's a hot topic these days because, Amazon has been adding more and more functionality to some of their attribution products. And there's more ability to be able to close the loop there and be able to tie back attribution with, say, Google or Facebook ads to the actual buy box and see how those ads are performing on Amazon. So I think the jury's still out on that one, but it does appear that there's some indication that using Google to drive traffic via search to Amazon in some categories is a good investment and does provide some halo lift to your top line sales. But we're doing more tests on that to evaluate exactly how that is impacting your performance on Amazon and using some of the Amazon attribution capabilities. But, wherever you have the ability to compare kind of apples to apples from a KPI perspective, so Amazon attribution is a great example of that, being able to look at one RoAS versus another RoAS, like versus like, and be able to evaluate which one's a better investment. That's really what it comes down to. Let the numbers do the talking and identify which one appears to be a better investment and double down until it is no longer.
Yeah. Awesome. Great answer. Great question. Let's get to a few more questions here. So this is related again to supply chains. What ad strategies can brands take when they are experiencing delays with their inventory?
Yeah, that is a very challenging problem to have, of course. And, I would really go back to those fundamentals that I outlined earlier about having the preparation in place ahead of time so that you understand if this product is out of stock or if it is a threat to go out of stock, or if my supply chain is unpredictable and I don't know when the product's going to be back in stock. Being able to pivot to lower priority advertised products so that you have alternatives ahead of time. And then, having those triggers determined in terms of weeks of cover so that you can identify what that looks like. And in some instances, it may not simply be about your inventory within an Amazon fulfillment center and how many weeks of cover you have there. You may be going all the way back to here's what our supply chain looks like. And we have this many weeks of cover, but our supply chain is this far out. So at this point, we need to make a critical decision. How that math works out for the individual manufacturer is a decision to be made internally. But if you want to build out that kind of full funnel inventory and supply position and evaluation so that you know when to trigger your next product up, I think that would be a really well-informed way to go about doing it.
Awesome. Great question. Now, here's another question for you, Connor, is why have advertising costs, specifically for PPC, risen in recent times, and how have brands responded to this?
Yeah, I mean, it does come down to some of those pandemic consumer behavior changes that have really driven the increase in PPC costs. Simply, brick and mortar foot traffic became a lot less valuable because there was less of it. And so where dollars may have once been going into shelf slotting fees and end caps and those kind of investments, they were chasing the consumer online and paying for digital shelf space. And so there was just a lot more competition moving on to advertising platforms like Amazon because they were following the consumers. In terms of how brands have responded to this challenge, we've seen significantly more demand for technology to be able to address it, being able to use things like machine learning automation to gain greater efficiency from their ad spend. So that's probably been one of the largest. We've also seen more investment in talent and expertise, which is an ongoing trend where these brands are looking for more Amazon expertise and Amazon advertising expertise specifically.
Interesting. Okay. Got another question here for you, Connor. From the chat here is how did the changes Amazon has made recently to their ad platform impact downstream and its functionality?
Yeah. So, we have such a close relationship with Amazon. On an average week, we're meeting with them multiple times. We're ahead of most of these changes that they're making. Oftentimes we're enrolled in betas ahead of time. So as an API partner with Amazon, we're oftentimes well aware of changes before advertisers using the console may see it. So we're prepared. We've done the development up front, so we're not really on our heels reacting to it. So it's a strong relationship that allows us to ensure that none of these things are taking us by surprise, and we're able to deliver them with the most thoughtful the most thoughtful way we can to our customers.
Awesome. That's really cool. We have one more question here for you, Connor. Unless you guys want to add any more questions to the comments here, the last question on our list here is another supply chain one. So, do you think that these supply chain issues will continue to have an impact on advertising on the short haul as well as the long haul?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a great one. So every projection that I have seen from people much smarter than I with a better view of all this than I have is that we're going to continue to see supply chain disruptions for at least the next 18 months. And that's about as far out as anybody's looking. So I would not anticipate that on a macro level, this is going to be resolved at any point soon, unfortunately.
Okay.
And so with that, yes, it's going to continue to impact the products that you're advertising, and thus it's going to impact your advertising. Now, with more consumers going back in store, we're starting to see some moderation in the competitive landscape on Amazon and other e-commerce advertising platforms. So it may become less challenging than it was, but only marginally.
Okay.
So probably both in the short and long haul, supply chain is going to continue to be a factor here, and customers are going to continue to look for smart solutions to do that, which we have at Downstream, I'm happy to report. So if this is a significant headache, I'd encourage those folks to talk to us.
Awesome. Well, perhaps that's a good segue here. Or sorry, a few more questions came in. Let's get these answers. These are good. So Carlos asked, what KPI should I focus on to measure healthy ROI?
Healthy ROI. So, there are a few options there, and healthy ROI. That's kind of a broad question. Oftentimes, folks in our circles will focus on metrics like tacos, which is, taking into account more of your organic search presence and your top line business into the overall RoAS calculation, with the idea that that's supposed to give you kind of a broader view of your whole business and how your advertising is impacting your total business. There are ways to look directionally at incrementality, which I think is a concept that many sellers don't necessarily weight as heavily as perhaps they should. This is really how many of the smart brand marketers look at their business, in terms of how many incremental dollars or incremental customers is my advertising driving, meaning customers who would not have otherwise purchased my products. Because at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to do with advertising, is get some lift in your business. So, using market share data or data like you may be able to extract from our Cobalt platform, that's going to give you more kind of top line insight into how your business is growing overall, with increased ad investment or decreased ad investment, how it's impacting your business. So, I'd encourage anybody who's really trying to look harder at ROI on their advertising dollars, consider looking at metrics like tacos, but then also consider looking at more kind of market share data to try to look directionally at the incremental impact on your business.
Okay. Awesome. So we have another question here is, does PPC play a factor in Amazon's optimization algorithm? Or how much does it?
Optimization algorithm. So I think what that question is asking is in terms of the search algorithm. I think that's the question there.
Yeah.
So in the early days of AMS, Amazon Search Advertising, it was a direct feed, and Amazon was just factoring in consumer behavior on advertising as though it was organic. But they broke that a long time ago. There are some smaller signals, however, that will still factor into organic. I mean, it's a very small portion of the overall kind of SEO algorithm, the A9 algorithm on Amazon. But your top line sales on Amazon will spin the flywheel in certain ways by being able to drive up Amazon's perceived demand for your product, your
Okay.
product being picked up in things like the S9 merchandising widgets, et cetera, all that kind of stuff, which in turn will increase your organic search presence. Top line sales is a much smaller signal in Amazon's search algorithms, but it is still there. And so in kind of a roundabout way, advertising can still feed in and provide some search goodness, but it's not a direct one-to-one correlation.
Interesting. Okay. So would you say that, advertising certainly helps you increase your organic, rankings as well? I think maybe what Carlos is also mentioning as well is like, can you increase your organic rankings through advertising, or is that strictly separate?
To an extent.
Yeah.
To an extent. The largest signal with A9 and Amazon search algorithm is clicks.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Every other signal on Amazon is just too scarce to be able to build a search algorithm around. And so clicks is the most heavily weighted signal in any of their search algos. However, top line sales is a much smaller signal, and there is some halo impact that you will gain through what is attributed to your advertising. It's minimal, but it's still there.
Okay.
And additionally, none of this exists in a vacuum, right? I think oftentimes we have these conversations as though it does, but it does not. You have competition.
Yes.
And so there is a lot of value in being able to suppress your competition, reduce their share of voice, and thus reduce their attributed sales.
Interesting.
So there's upside. There's also perceived opportunity costs if you don't advertise. And of course, your competitors are also experiencing some opportunity costs when you're shoving them out.
That's a really interesting insight. Cool. Well, I do believe we're at the bottom of our questions here. If you are watching, thank you so much for submitting your questions. I do hope you gained a ton of value from this webinar. Connor, first off, thank you so much for joining. Appreciate it.
A lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you guys so much for joining, and we'll see you next time.